This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Luke chapter 4, verses 1 to 13. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on March 9, 2025. It's the Sunday we launch our new series called Believe, Discovering Faith and Hope in Jesus. So let's hear this text from Luke chapter 4, beginning at verse 1, which is, of course, the basis for this sermon, which is the first Sunday in Lent. So let's hear the text. Now, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led around by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days, and when they had ended, he was hungry. And the devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered him, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone." And he led him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, "I will give you all this dominion and its glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I give it to whomever I want. Therefore, if you worship before me, it shall all be yours." And Jesus replied to him, "It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only." And he brought him into Jerusalem and had him stand at the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will give his angels orders concerning you to protect you. And on their hands they will lift you up, so that you do not strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered and said to him, "It has been stated, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." And so when the devil had finished every temptation, he left him until an opportune time. This story in Luke's Gospel, beginning at chapter 4, is in the other two synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Mark. They're called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they see together the life of Jesus. They see the story of Jesus in very much similar terms, whereas the Gospel of John sees the story of Jesus' life differently. So Luke has some uniquenesses in this story that, in the way that he shares it, that aren't divergent from Matthew and Mark, but conclude his own kind of nuance about what happens in this episode with the devil in the wilderness. So let's just set the stage first. Now, this story in Luke's Gospel is set directly next to Jesus' baptism. Now, if you were to go today to see approximately where this location might have been, there's a monastery that's been built by Orthodox monks into the cliffside directly above where Jesus was baptized in Bethany beyond the Jordan. So if you were at the Jordan River and then you looked up to the west at the mountains, you would be able to see the wilderness that Luke is describing here. So understanding the proximity of these things helps. Jesus comes out of the water and then moves directly into the wilderness. Now, Luke is careful to note that Jesus is full of the Holy Spirit. It's one of Luke's favorite descriptions. He uses it not only here in the Gospel, but he uses it in the book of Acts quite a bit. And it's the idea here is that Jesus was led by the Spirit. So this isn't just a accidental wandering in the wilderness and then the devil ambushed him. There's a sense here that this is about Jesus being led by the Spirit and Jesus cooperating with the movement of that Spirit. Now, it says in the text that for 40 days, Jesus was tempted by the devil. Now, the word choice of Luke is very particular because he uses the word devil. The word devil means diabolical one. That's kind of the schemer, if you will. And it is grounded within the Greek context. Greek-speaking people would have understood exactly what Luke meant by the devil. If it were a more Jewish audience, we would see something like Satan or Satan, the accuser. Or in Matthew's gospel, he tells the story describing what Luke calls the devil as the tempter. And so remember, these Gospels are written to people in different places and communities. So it's important that the people they're written to understand what it means. So Luke uses the word devil in this case. Now, Jesus was tempted during the entire 40 days, not just at the end of the 40 days, but the entire 40 days. He ate nothing. He was hungry by the end of those days. And remember what happened immediately before these temptations. What happened is that Jesus came out of the water of baptism, and the voice came from heaven saying, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." So in a sense, that voice from heaven about who Jesus is what's at stake here. This is what these temptations are going to be about. Now, these temptations are not extraordinary occurrences. Remember, Jesus has been in the wilderness. He hasn't eaten for 40 days. He's hungry, and we'd be hungry too. So each of these temptations in some ways is similar to experiences we might have. And that opens up a key passageway to us. Being purposeful brings obstacles and temptations. And certainly one of the temptations we often face today is the temptation of ease. And some would frame this temptation as a matter of temptations, let's say, as a matter of spiritual warfare. The devil opposes those who seek God's call. Others might say that these events are normal, that it's normal to encounter temptation and difficulty and obstacles and resistance when we choose to set our life toward God's calling. So regardless of your theology around this, the dynamic is relatively the same. It's a matter of overcoming, in some ways, the conformity of this world, overcoming the sin of conformity. So as we talk about this episode as it unfolds, it's in every way a matter of spiritual engagement. Temptation exists for those who are guided by God's grace and purpose in their life. When we choose God's grace and love, at times hardship's going to happen because we're going to be making choices that do not place us at the center. And so the ramifications of our choices for God can't stop us from doing what God is calling us to do. So temptation in many ways is kind of that gray area that sounds right, but isn't quite right because it doesn't fulfill God's glorious purpose for each and every life. So let's look at the first temptation. This first temptation in many ways is about being self-serving. This is a temptation about privilege. Does Jesus enjoy a special place that warrants no hunger? Remember, the temptations of Jesus immediately follow him coming out of the water of baptism, where the voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased." So if that's the case, what the devil is suggesting in this temptation is that, well, the Son of God, of all people, shouldn't go hungry. So the devil is keen to quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6. All of these descriptions that we read in Deuteronomy 6 align to wandering in the wilderness for 40 years by the Israelites. 40 is an important number in the Bible. 40 days, 40 weeks, 40 months, 40 years. It represents almost every time we read it in the Bible, temptation, testing, purification, or sanctification. So we often read this text, for example, in churches at the beginning of Lent, which is a 40-day long fast as we prepare for Easter, so that we kind of connect with this symbolic value of the number 40. So in this particular story in Luke, Jesus is asked to turn stones into bread, not for someone else, but for himself. And so the devil thinks, as I mentioned a moment ago, that the Son of God should not go hungry. So the issue here is about Jesus' relationship as son. So at question is really not the bread, but it's actually Jesus' relationship and whether that relationship should be exploited for Jesus' own purpose, or shall Jesus use his relationship with God for a greater purpose? So Jesus responds to the devil by a response lifted from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. And what he says here is that physical need and hunger are not the driving factors of our life. He's saying that ambition, in some ways, is good. It's just a matter of where the ambition is directed. And that opens up another key passageway for us. Counting on God's provision defeats our notion of helping ourselves. You see, what we learn a little bit in the story of Jesus' temptation is that we're not passive agents. We have to actively choose to place our reliance on God's provision. Jesus affirms that our life is more than just bread. Well, whatever that may be for us, it might be, some instances, literal bread. In other cases, it might be something else. But what the call here is to live a purposeful life directed by God's Spirit. That's the temptation Jesus is facing. Is he going to use his position for his own ends, or is he going to use his position for the ends of God's people? So thus, a life of our part of prayer, communion, community, of worship, that keeps our focus on God, keeps us focused on our purpose and God's provision for us, rather than just simply helping ourselves. Let's turn to the second temptation that Jesus faces. With this one is much more about being self-centered. The devil then suggests that Jesus could receive all honor and all authority of all the nations by redirecting his worship. Once again, this is about Jesus' relationship to God. The devil's temptation is not about the end game. Whether Jesus bows and worships Satan and has authority over all the nations, or whether Jesus goes to the cross and resurrection, has the same end game of being an authority over all the nations. So the issue isn't the end game, the outcome. The issue is how you get there. And what Satan is suggesting here is a shortcut that might serve Jesus's economy well, but it will fail everything he must do as the Son. So in other words, the devil's saying, I'll give you all the authority you want without having to go to the cross and resurrection. You can have that now rather than through that journey. The difference is that if Jesus worships Satan, he forfeits the redemption of all of humanity. So Jesus then would deny the world the gift of his love if he chose to simply worship Satan in that moment. So there's a kind of a hair being split here, and it's what kind of authority will Jesus yield or give? Is his authority based out of sheer power and ambition, or is it framed out of love? Another way of saying it could be, is Jesus going to be self-centered or other-centered? Shall we do things the way the world makes them happen, or the way God makes them happen? Which one endures? Which one lasts? It opens a key passageway to us here, that God's economy runs on the fuel of love. You know, Jesus has given a shortcut that benefits him only and no one else. Yes, he would rule, but by all the means that the Romans were ruling the world, by power and by fear. It's interesting when reading the story, don't let it get lost on you, that in the political machinations of Jesus's day, where he's offered all of this authority by Satan, notice how Satan claims that authority for himself. The devil claims it for himself. And so what you're being told implicitly in the story is that in some way that the devil is in the works in all of that, in the economies of power and fear and kind of brazen control. So what we find in this temptation, when we talk about how God's economy runs on the fuel of love, is that every situation we're called to consider how our lives can multiply and expand grace. See, what Satan or the devil is offering Jesus is a way that doesn't multiply or expand anything. So it's like a mathematical formula. The devil is offering Jesus a 1 + 1 = 2, whereas Jesus is offering perhaps something exponential through his death and his resurrection. So the question in the temptation, will we live by love, which is the doing of that which benefits others, or by fear, doing that which benefits ourselves? Shall others' experience of love or fear impact us? What grows? What expands? What shares that love in a greater way versus what kills it, which in this case is being self-centered? Let's turn to the third temptation now, and this one is really about being self-absorbed. This final temptation focuses on Jesus' interaction with death. Now, the devil suggests that Jesus can be prevented from experiencing death. He says, throw yourself off the temple. There's a certain precipice in mind here, of course, that the tallest point of the temple is very public, very noticeable. People would see it. And this is less about Jesus' relationship as son, but it's still grounded in it. It's really about his capacity as son. So Satan's temptation the devil's temptation to him is, why experience death when you don't have to? It's more than just a shortcut here that the devil's offering him. It's really about self-absorption. Is Jesus' purposefulness shaped by what's good for him? In a way, the devil is saying to him, isn't martyrdom overrated? And so to do so is to force God's hand of divine protection as a public spectacle. So Jesus throws himself off the temple. The angels come and keep him from, hitting the ground. Jesus' death will not be, how can I say this? The temptation at the temple is about avoiding death by relying on God's protection for him, but that stops the very thing that Jesus has come to do. Jesus' death will be just as public, but it's going to be at a time of his choosing. So, shall Jesus be rescued from death? Shall Jesus and the cosmos be rescued through death? That's the final key passageway for us. We are a people preserved through life and death, not rescued from either. I'm going to say that again. We are a people preserved through life and death, not rescued from either. You see, self-absorption leads us into a space where cause and effect place us at the center. So Jesus' antidote, though, for this life is bigger than just his own life. Our vision can't be driven by what suits us best, but what suits God best, thus the world's best. These temptations, all three of them, reflect realities we face every day. We might say, don't I deserve better than what I already have? That would be the first temptation. Another one might be, why should I worry about how people experience me? That's the second temptation. And how can I make a situation as easy as possible for me? That's the third one. These are questions we face on the giving end and on the receiving end each day. And so Jesus shows us a way to be set free and saved from their bondage. The idea of what Jesus is being tempted with here is whether or not he will commit to the work of redeeming all of creation, or whether he will do what's expedient for himself. If you have comments and reflections, I invite you to visit my website, revcraig.com. Click on News in the upper right-hand corner, and then on the drop-down menu, you'll see Podcast. Click on this week's episode and leave a comment. Also encourage you to visit ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.